Hello and welcome to another episode of Guess That Record. I am your host, Jackson Reed. This is the show where we talk about music and try to figure out which album I pulled from my collection. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode. Your support is always appreciated. Our guest today is a two-time Grammy Award-winning producer and executive who is currently the president of Pure Tone Music. He previously was the president of A&R for Atlantic Records and has worked for many other major labels over the course of his career. He's also the host of Rock and Roll High School, a podcast currently in its fourth season. I'm super excited to welcome Pete Ganbarg to Guess That Record. How are you doing, Pete?
I'm doing great, Jackson. How are you?
I'm good. It's great to have you on the show. Of course, you've had an amazing career in A&R and running your own company and all that stuff. And I'm really excited to get to speak with you today.
Thank you. I've been very lucky. If somebody had told me when I was 16 years old that there was a job that actually paid you to listen to music, I wouldn't have believed them, but here I am many years later, and there is a job that pays you to listen to music. So how about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, I always love to start off these interviews by asking, what was the first song or the first album you remember hearing that made you take music seriously?
The first album that I ever bought, close to the Canadian border from Detroit, Michigan, was Bob Seger. He had an album in 1979 called Stranger in Town, and that was the first album that I bought. And it wasn't that I was, the biggest Bob Seger fan in the world, but it was kind of my entry into kind of like buying something with my own money, owning it, putting it on my record player, listening to it, and kind of entering that world. And, I played it so much that one of the songs at the end of one of the sides on the album started skipping. So now whenever I hear that song on the radio, I imagine I just wait for the skip because that's how my ear hears it.
Yeah.
But that was kind of my entry into, oh, this is a thing. I could kind of like jump into their worlds the way that you could, with a novel or with a film or with a piece of art. And now I'm doing it via music, and I'm in.
Yeah. And that's a great album for your first one. So
yeah, well, go Canada. He was actually, even though he's from Detroit, there was a radio station on the Detroit Canadian border that played his music and helped break his music first in Canada, then in Detroit, and then in the rest of the world.
Would that have been in Windsor?
That was Rosalie Trombley at CKLW, of course.
Nice. Then I was also kind of curious, were you a musician yourself starting out, or have you just sort of been a fan, I guess?
I played instruments in school. I read music. I took lessons, but I was much more passionate about being a listener than I was being a performer.
Okay, yeah. And then how did you get into the business side of it?
I think that you talk about success being a combination of preparation and luck. From the age of 13 or 14, right after I bought that Bob Seger album, I was studying up on every song and every chart and going out and buying records and becoming a DJ to play parties to make a couple of $100 a weekend to go and afford the records that I wanted to buy. And so all through high school, I was reading Billboard magazine every week. I was making notes of what was popular and what wasn't. And when I went to college, I wanted a school with a good radio station because I thought I was going to be a DJ. And the school that I chose ended up being a lot more than that because I met a guy first day freshman year who had a buddy from home whose dad was in the music business. And long story short, I ended up working for that guy 5 years later doing A&R and haven't looked back since.
Gotcha. And I think it would be good, to maybe explain for, the listeners who aren't maybe familiar with it, what exactly do you do when you're in A&R?
A&R stands for Artist and Repertoire, and the way that I describe it, it's almost like a record company is a train, and the A&R is the engine. Because if there's no engine, the train's not going to run. Meaning that the A&R department, Artist and Repertoire, is responsible for discovering and signing the artists. And if you're not signing artists, there's no fuel in the engine. If you're signing the wrong artists that people don't like, the engine is not going to go. It's going to be a broken engine. If you do your job well, the engine is going to be finely tuned and humming, and the rest of the train is going to move.
Gotcha. Yeah. And it's sort of interesting when you look at your career arc, because you've worked at a lot of different labels, but of course for most of your career you were with Atlantic. When you first got that opportunity to go there, did you sort of think that this was going to be a place you would be around for a while?
No, actually, by the time I got to Atlantic, I was close to 20 years in doing A&R already. So I had done my time with Clive Davis. I had done my time at Epic Records and EMI Records and SBK Records. And I think that the Atlantic opportunity was unique in that they gave me the chance to actually run the department, which I had never done before. So I did that for 16 years, and not only was I responsible for what the label was signing, but who was doing the signing. So I was responsible for hiring A&R people, and we like to find young people who aren't maybe cynical or jaded yet by, the business is a tough business. It could chew you up and spit you out. So we wanted to try to find young people who we could bring in early before there was a cynicism about how they looked at the music business, and give them the opportunity to grow and be mentored. And, luckily we did that. And those are the people who are now running that A&R department now, guys who I gave the baton to, but hired first when they were 18, 19 years old.
Yeah. And it's, Atlantic for me is always one of the first labels I think of. I always remember because one of my like early influences was Led Zeppelin. And I always remember, like getting their records, and they had the big orange and green label on the record. And so I always, Atlantic is always one of those first record labels you think of, I feel like. So what was it like to work for such a historic label?
It was awesome. The thing that was so great about working at Atlantic for the time that I worked there, it was an incredibly stable record label, which is not usual, not ordinary. The two people who were running Atlantic when I got there was a creative head and an operational head, and that was Craig Kalman on the creative side, and Julie Greenwald on the operational side. And the two of them had a great partnership that lasted literally 20 years. And I think what was so special for me being part of that partnership, I was there for 16 out of those 20 years. So, 80% of the time that they were there, I was running their A&R department for them. And it was great because nobody left. And when you have stability in leadership and who's running the record company, you can be patient and you can sign a baby artist who may take a year or two or three, or an album or two or three to break, and you're not panicking and you're not rushing. Obviously, nothing lasts forever, especially with labels who are owned by corporations who have taken the company public, and you have share price and you have stockholders. So nothing is ever going to last forever, but that 20-year run is ridiculously rare, and to be part of it for 80% of that run was, definitely something I'm super proud of.
Hmm. And you kind of mentioned it there, how, Atlantic, of course, is a part of Warner Music Group. Um, is when you're a part of a conglomeration like that, do you have to answer to the top quite a bit, or did you guys have sort of the freedom to make decisions on behalf of Atlantic?
I think that if you make your numbers, they leave you alone. But then it's almost a double-edged sword. If you make your numbers and the numbers are too good, then every year the budget resets and they set the bar higher. So, okay, you made X this year. So next year we expect X times X. Well, no, we had a lucky year. We did well, just leave us alone. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. But like I said, when you're a public company, you have to answer to shareholders. And that's a whole different ball game than a 13-year-old kid buying a Bob Seger album.
For sure. This episode of Guess That Record is sponsored by Marvel Marketing. Marvel Marketing is an award-winning digital marketing company headquartered in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Working with clients in different industries from all over North America, including Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Marvel Marketing services include website design and development, website maintenance, search engine optimization, public relations services, and social media management, amongst others. To find out more, visit marvelmarketing.ca. This episode of Guess That Record is sponsored by Guitar Works. One of Canada's top independent music stores for over 30 years, Guitar Works carries a huge selection of musical instruments from the biggest brands in music, including Gibson, Fender, Martin, Yamaha, and Paul Reed Smith. Visit any of their 3 Calgary locations or shop online at guitarworks.ca and join the Guitar Perks program to earn money back with every purchase. Guitar Works, your total guitar store. This episode of Guess That Record is also sponsored by Recordland, home to the largest selection of music in Canada. Buy, sell, and trade tapes, CDs, and vinyl. Located in Calgary's Inglewood neighborhood on 9th Avenue Southeast, visit them in person or on Instagram at Recordland Calgary. And then, while all that was happening, you also had your own company, Pure Tone Music, which does a whole bunch of stuff. Would you be able to explain what goes on with Pure Tone?
Yeah, I like, to not put all my eggs in one basket, and I like juggling. So I realized a long time ago, somebody told me as I started to do A&R, they said, oh, A&R is great, but you know what's really great? Music publishing. The A&R guys traditionally, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the A&R guys were, jittery, smoking cigarettes and pale by the pool. The publishers were tan, smoking cigars, that's like, and relaxed. So I said, oh, I should try some of this. So I started my own publishing company before I got to Atlantic, maybe close to 20 years ago, and that's done really well. That's under the Pure Tone name. I have a podcast that I do under the Pure Tone name that is a podcast about the history of contemporary music as told by those who helped create it. It's called Rock and Roll High School. We're in our 4th season. We put out over 50 episodes. Each episode is an hour-long candid conversation with an icon of contemporary music. The idea is to tell the story of the history of contemporary music and, one voice at a time. And so we've got a long way to go, but we're off to a decent start.
For sure. And, getting back into sort of the, I guess, the business side of Pure Tone, it's now currently a part of Atlantic Records. Is that correct?
It is and it isn't. I have, again, things got complicated as you move along in this business and spend more time in it. I have a record label. Pure Tone has a label. 2 of the artists on the Pure Tone label are in partnership with my friends at Atlantic. And then I also continue to work on the artists that I worked at when I was the A&R head at Atlantic. I continue to work with some of them, but there's more freedom for me now to do more independent things and more to spend more time juggling some of the other balls that might not fit into the the corporate major label A&R milieu, which is Atlantic.
For sure. And, since you've been doing this for a long time, I would love to sort of hear how you break this down. But I've always kind of had the impression, just from speaking with other people in the business, that A&R is, part of it is discovering, new artists that you could potentially sign, and then looking after who you already have on the roster. How much, like, what's sort of the breakdown of that in your experience?
I think any time that I've worked for a company, the goal was to make sure that the company was successful. So it had less to do with me having to be the hero all the time by discovering and signing the artist. It was more like, oh, if there's an artist already on roster that I did not sign, but I can contribute and help, it's a team. And it was very important to me, any label that I worked at, to contribute to the team. So some of the biggest successes that I've had as an A&R person, I've had with artists that I have not signed, but just as a team member who is, raising his hand to say, "Hey, I'd love to help. I'd love to contribute. How can I help?"
And what are the ways you sort of help an artist already on the label?
You can say to them, a lot of it is every artist is unique. And so you sit with the artist and you say, "What do you want to accomplish?" And they're going to tell you what they want to accomplish with this new project. You're either going to think it's a good idea or a lousy idea. If you think it's a lousy idea, you're going to tell them candidly why you think that this idea is potentially problematic, and here is what we could potentially do to fix it. And then ultimately, what are the building blocks to get from idea to final product, right? So we need songs. Are you going to come up with the songs, or do we need to go outside for the songs? Do we need to go to outside songwriters? Do we need to do collaborative work with co-writing sessions? Are you going to produce the record? Do we need to find an outside producer? Um, if we need to find an outside producer, who do you think is right? Who do I think is right? And it's basically creative problem solving, right? So figure that every project is 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and I'm there with the artist putting the jigsaw pieces together, and hopefully we come up with something beautiful to look at the end. But, you know, business being business, sometimes it's beautiful, sometimes it's ugly, and we never want to look at it again, but we get back up and we try again.
For sure. And then, you just alluded to it a little bit ago, but of course, one part of your business, your brand right now is the Rock and Roll High School podcast. And I wanted to get into that a bit because it's you've had a very impressive list of guests to appear on the show. Who are some of the highlights you've had so far?
Well, I am like a song-oriented A&R person first and foremost. A&R stands for artists and repertoire, like we said. So the artists are obviously the performers themselves. The repertoire is the music, the copyrights, the songs. I think one of the reasons that I've been able to have a 35-year career in A&R is because I've always focused on the R. I think the A is, shinier, sexier. And it's like, who wouldn't want to discover, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin? But the R is what really keeps the artist going, is the songs, is the repertoire, is the copyright. So I think that for me, I've always worshiped at the altar of the songwriter. So some of my favorite guests on the podcast have been those songwriters, to get to talk to Jimmy Webb, to get to talk to Gamble and Huff, to get to talk to Paul Williams, to get to talk to some of the Brill Building guys like Barry Mann, who with his wife Cynthia Weil wrote You've Lost That Loving Feeling, or Jeff Barry with his ex-wife Ellie Greenwich, who wrote River Deep, Mountain High, and, just ridiculous songs that are so part of everyday culture that we sometimes forget. Oh, somebody wrote that? That song hasn't existed since the beginning of time. So to get to speak to the songwriters is very special.
Absolutely. And I think you kind of mentioned, or in the, I saw in the press release for the podcast, that the podcast was sort of, it came from an idea when you were at Atlantic about educating your A&R people. Is that correct?
That's right, because the blessing and the curse of hiring young A&R people is that they're young. That's the blessing. The curse is since they're so young, they know nothing. And they kept proving that to me over and over again, where they didn't know the history of music going back to the early days of rock and roll in the 50s and the birth of the rock and roll era in 1955 with Bill Haley, Rock Around the Clock, and Little Richard and Chuck Berry. They didn't know this stuff. So I've always been a big believer that you have to know that stuff, because if you're talking to a new artist who you want to sign, but that new artist grew up on their grandparents' record collection, and they're a folk singer, and their biggest influences were, Tim Hardin and Phil Oakes and people like that. You have to understand the language, and if you don't, you're giving the competition a leg up to get in there and box you out. And so I said, look, if you don't know this, I'm going to have to teach you. And we started class, and we started, lecturing about, okay, let's start in 1955. There is a definitive starting line for the history of contemporary music, and it's 1955. Let's start there. And the classes got really popular because everybody wanted to learn this stuff. And by the time we got to current day, it was standing room only. There were a ton of people coming to the class. And that's when I decided to start bringing in guests. So, Graham Nash from Crosby, Stills and Nash came in. Clive Davis came in. A bunch of people started coming in. And then when the pandemic lockdown happened in 2020, I was asked by the Warner Music Group to do it on Zoom. And as long as we were doing it on Zoom, we were able to press record and turn it into a podcast. And we're now, like I said, 50 episodes in, 4 seasons in, and just going. I'm doing interviews all the time, and I love it because I get to learn. You never stop learning. Like, oh, that song exists because of something that this week's guest did. Well, let's talk about that. Let's learn about it. And so I'm learning about it. The guest gets to talk about it, and the people who listen to the podcast, which hopefully includes some of my, former kids who didn't know anything, can learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's been the most surprising thing about starting a podcast for you?
I think it's the stories that are out there. That when I was a kid, there was a book written by a music industry executive named Joe Smith. Joe Smith, legendary music industry executive. A lot of people don't know his name, but he was he played two big roles in the history of the industry of music. He was the president of a bunch of record labels, including Elektra and Warner Brothers and Capitol. But he was also, there are a lot of charities that go along with the music business. And so when you're raising money for charities, you have dinners honoring your guest of honor. And Joe Smith became the master of ceremonies for all these dinners. He was very funny, and everyone loved him. And he knew all the artists, he knew everybody, and he started talking to them. And in the 80s, he published a book called Off the Record, and it was conversations with all of these legendary musicians. And those conversations are now in the Smithsonian. They're that historic. So, Joe passed away a few years ago. My vision for the Rock and Roll High School podcast is, one day maybe these conversations could turn into living history, because unfortunately, as some of our guests get older and pass away, they're not around anymore. But their stories are, and their voices are, and the songs are. So the goal of starting this podcast is hopefully for generations to come, they can hear these stories directly from these artists, these producers, these songwriters themselves. That's
Mm-hmm.
the goal.
Yeah. It's I totally get that because uh, we had a guest on this podcast a couple years ago named Floyd Sneed, and Floyd was the drummer for Three Dog Night, and I was excited to speak with Floyd because he's also from Calgary, but that ended up being his final interview as he passed away a few months later, and it was kind of like, wow, it's good we had him on to kind of share these stories and preserve them. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's really sad. I've spoken, unfortunately, I've spoken to a bunch of people who are no longer alive. I spoke to Lamont Dozier from the brilliant Motown songwriting team of Holland Dozier Holland. He passed away, but his interview is available for everybody to hear, and he's brilliant. I spoke to Sam Moore from the legendary Stax duo Sam and Dave. Sam Moore passed away within the last year. His interview is out. And then unfortunately, I interviewed a few people who have passed away, but I it was so long ago that we did the interviews that we don't have the tapes. I interviewed Michael Lang, who started Woodstock, the festival. It was Michael Lang's festival, and he was
mhm.
great. He passed away. So I interviewed Denny Lane from Paul McCartney's band Wings and the Moody Blues, and he passed away. So it's a race. We're going to try to get as many of these done as we can, and hopefully our guests will live forever. If not, their voices definitely will.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to get your take on this because, of course, I'm starting out in the music business. So when I get guests on this podcast, it's almost always cold outreach, um, and I was sort of curious with your experience in the business, being involved with Atlantic for as long as you've been and other major labels. Is it, do you already have relationships with a lot of these guests or have previous connections? Like, is it, what's the process for you in getting people on your show?
It's everything. At this point, we want to cast as wide a net as possible and bring on the best possible guests. So, some I've worked with this season alone. I'm thrilled that people that I've worked with, Chaka Khan, the band America, Billy Gibbons from ZZ Top, all friends who I've worked with in the past, have been on the podcast. But, there are a bunch of people I've worked with who haven't been on the podcast. So, you try to just get the word out to people, hey, so and so who is friendly with this person. Like there's somebody who worked inside the Warner Music Group a few years ago who had a friend of a friend who knew Todd Rundgren. And they called me, would you like Todd? I'm like, of course I'd like Todd. And the next week, Todd, is zooming in and he's on the podcast. So it's like the more the merrier. If somebody who's listening thinks that they know someone who'd be a great guest for our podcast, they should reach out. And I'm sure if somebody's listening thinks they know a great guest for your podcast, they can reach out too. It's like the more the merrier. We're not precious.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, Pete. We are going to be entering into the guessing segment of this podcast here. So I'll explain the rules to you and any new listeners we may have. Inside this bag here is a record from my collection. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 3 clues about this record. And then we will play a game of 20 questions to try and figure out what it is. So, Pete Ganbarg, are you ready to guess that record?
I am ready.
All right. So, here are your 3 clues. This album came out in the 1990s. It is a 4-disc box set, and it features songs recorded between the early 70s and the late 90s.
Question 1.
Was this a record that I was personally involved in?
No.
Question 2.
Okay. Was this a record? Was the artist who made this record a solo artist?
Yes.
Question 3.
Is the artist known for their instrumental ability or their vocal ability?
I think both, but probably more for like the lyrics and vocals. Yeah.
Question 4.
Was this an artist signed ever to Atlantic Records?
No.
Question 5.
Was this an artist ever signed to Columbia Records?
Yes.
Question 6.
Is this artist from New Jersey?
Yes.
Question 7.
Okay. Does this artist play with a band called the E Street Band?
He most certainly does.
All right, then I'm getting warm here.
You are.
All right, so I assume that what is in your bag is Bruce Springsteen.
It is Bruce Springsteen. And you got
Do I have to guess the album?
If you want, you can.
Is the album Tracks?
It's Tracks.
Okay, there you go. That wasn't so bad.
Yeah. It of course. So you mentioned that that Bruce was one of your favorites. He's one of my favorites too. And what can you tell the listeners about Tracks?
Well, not so much about Tracks, but I'm very excited about Tracks 2. Have you read about Tracks 2?
Well, so it's funny because I was actually going to pick this for this episode regardless, because I was thinking, that would be kind of interesting to talk about, some deeper cuts and that sort of thing. And then last week they announced Tracks 2, which is 7 albums across I think from 83 to the 2000s, somewhere in there. And it's been talked, like there's been rumors about this for a long time, because of course Bruce's vault is just filled with stuff that hasn't seen the light of day. So yeah, I'm excited to see what's in there.
Yeah, I mean Bruce is awesome. I've never met him. I'm just a fan. They're like any artist, having worked in the music business myself for 35 years, there are a couple of degrees of separation between me and Bruce. But like I had Stevie Van Zandt on my podcast. That's one of them. I have a good buddy of mine who's a record producer named Ron Aniello. He's Bruce's current producer.
Mm-hmm.
My buddy Dave Cobb, who is also a record producer, is the music supervisor for the Bruce Springsteen Deliver Me From Nowhere film adaptation starring Jeremy Allen White. I'm a voracious reader, so it's always on hand right here.
I read that one too. It's good.
Great book. So Dave is super excited about the music that they're creating for that film. And then John Landau, who is Bruce's manager, I have the pleasure of meeting one time. Actually, I've met him twice, but one time project-based, where I A&R'd a band that John Landau was managing at the time called Train. And we ended up putting a song together for their new album called Hey Soul Sister. That became a big hit for the band. And John was managing the band, Pat Monahan, the singer, and I sat in a meeting, just the three of us together for an hour, talking about the plan for Train's A&R vision. Remember, I told you that you have to sit down with the artist and say, what do you want to accomplish? That was that meeting with me, Pat, and John.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we've been lucky on this podcast to have, some, connections to Bruce. We've had 2 E Street Band members on the show as well. So we,
Nice.
Here in Calgary, Bruce performed in November, and we got to interview Barry Danielian, who is Bruce's trumpet player. And then
Amazing.
Last week, I did an interview with Ozzy Melendez, who's the trombone player in the E Street Band. So
Amazing.
So we've had some connections with Bruce there. Now, when did you become a fan of his music?
My brother was a fan when we were kids. My brother was a big fan of Springsteen when he was in high school or junior high school. He eventually graduated to being a full-on Deadhead. But I remember, like it was yesterday, listening to bootleg concerts. Back then, you had to look really hard to find these live concert recordings. Now you can find them anywhere. Mainly from Bruce. He'll sell them to you,
Yep.
on his website. But back then, listening to these live recordings, which were kind of mythic at the time, and hearing like a 17, 18-minute version of growing up with the song stories about, let it rock and the whole thing. I can remember like yesterday. And I remember my brother, when he was a high school senior, you have to have a quote in your high school yearbook. You pick a quote, and his quote was, "Show a little faith, there's magic in the night," from Springsteen. That's always stuck with me too.
Yeah, yeah. And do you have any like favorite records of his that you can think of?
I mean, Jungle Land has probably been my favorite Springsteen song. I have a tendency personally to gravitate towards long songs as favorites. I don't know why. One of my favorite songs is by an R&B group from the 70s called the Floaters, and they had a song called Float On, and the long version is like 16 or 17 minutes long, and for me, that's still too short. So, in the time it takes Springsteen to record, to um, play the record of Jungle Land, I'm all in. I wish it could go longer.
Absolutely. Jungle Land was sort of the one that made me go like, okay, yeah, this guy's legit. It's and the best saxophone solo of all time, as far as I'm concerned as
Yeah.
well.
I mean, I love songs that are cinematic
Mhm.
when you can kind of shut your eyes and see the movie, and that song is 100% that.
Yeah, yeah. And then, going back to tracks here, it's kind of it's a tough one to sort of say what's your favorite on it, because there's so many on here. It's 4 discs, but is there anything from tracks that you can remember or that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, that was the first opportunity that we had to hear a bunch of songs that had never been released. So that was Pink Cadillac was on there. That was My Love Will Not Let You Down was on there. Um, Thundercrack, I remember coming off of that. Was Green Eyes on that record? Um,
Um, let's see.
he's so prolific
Yeah,
that it's so hard to remember. Well, that was on that album.
for sure.
Um, was it Green Eyes or Sad Eyes? I think it was
Sad
Sad Eyes.
Eyes. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
Sad Eyes is on that.
Hmm.
Great song.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, but again, it's like how many songs are on tracks? Like 50.
Yeah, I think it might be more than that. Um, but yeah, it's funny because like I think this is a huge reason why I love Bruce so much, because it's like there's so much more than the main albums, and it's like if you get bored with those, you can go listen to the unreleased stuff. And in a lot of cases, it's like, how was this unreleased? It's just as good as anything
Right.
on the actual
Right. And
records.
and and now we talked about tracks too. Um, you know, how crazy is it that they're going to be the equivalent of 7 full-length albums of
Mhm.
unheard Bruce Springsteen songs to listen to? It's crazy.
Yeah, yeah. And if there's one song I would want to highlight, that I have a kind of a funny story with, it's from tracks 1. It's "Lucky Man," which I believe was recorded during the Tunnel of Love sessions. And the reason I bring up "Lucky Man" is because at one part of the song, the lyric is, "Had a girl in Calgary, had to give her up." And I still remember the first time I heard that, it blew me away, because we don't get name dropped in songs very often. So I had to kind of rewind to be like, did he actually say Calgary? He did. So
That's awesome.
yeah, that's pretty cool. Well, Pete, we have reached the end of the interview. I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast. And where can the listeners find you and your podcast?
Well, the podcast is called Rock and Roll High School with Pete Ganbarg. It's available on any platform that you listen to podcasts on. We also have a website that features all of our previous interviews and our current interview at rockschoolpodcast.com.
Perfect. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Guess That Record. Make sure to leave a 5-star review wherever you listen and tell your friends to check us out. I want to shout out our radio partners currently airing Guess That Record as a syndicated show. CKMS in Kitchener, Ontario, CKXU in Lethbridge, Alberta, and South Devon Sound in Kingsbridge, UK. So if you're in those markets, be sure to check those stations out to hear the show. If you're with a radio station and you'd be interested in adding Guess That Record to your programming, send us an email to guessthatrecordpodcast@gmail.com. We'd also appreciate it if you follow us on Instagram and TikTok, where our username on both platforms is @GuessThatRecord. And lastly, subscribe to our YouTube channel to see the video versions of these amazing interviews. Remember to keep rocking, and we'll see you on the next episode of Guess That Record.